So good afternoon, everyone. I am Lenora from the Old Mill Museum in Lindsborg. This is being sponsored by the Smoky Valley Historical Association in partnership with the Lindsborg Old Mill and Swedish Heritage Museum. Our presentation is up and it is being funded by a grant from Humanities Kansas. Our presentation this afternoon is by Karen Humphry. Karen will be talking about Alma Swensson, who was the wife of the first president of Bethany College. So I will let Karen do a little bit further introduction. So let me go ahead and get my screen shared, and then I will turn it over to Karen.
And well, Lenora gets her screen share. She has my slides there. I have a script here. And many of you know about the book that I wrote and was published in 2012. And so there's a bigger story here. But today I just wanted to cover her life as best I could without taking too much time. And to say once again, what an honor and a privilege and a joy it was to do this research about Alma Swensson. You know, this serene photo is found in the Martin Luther room at Bethany Lutheran Church, where the choir gathers for rehearsals every week. You may have also seen this photo in books written by historians of Lindsborg throughout the several years, but it seemed the same few sentences were always written about Alma. 1, she was Mrs. Carl Aaron Swensson. 2, she was the organist at Bethany Church. And 3, she and Carl were founders of the Bethany Oratorio Society. In 2010, Chuck and I came back to Lindsborg after we left a few years earlier to come back to Minnesota. And we came back for the Messiah Festival. And I sat in the audience for the first time during the performance of Messiah. And when it was over, I looked around and I said to myself, somebody should write something about this because this is amazing. And then an inner voice said, maybe that should be you. But how to go about finding a story, and perhaps the story of Alma, her story beyond being Mrs. Carl Aaron Swensson. The next slide, please. So the next morning, Chuck and I were having breakfast at the Swedish Country Inn, and across the room was this woman, Jennifer Gonstrom, whom I knew was a great-grandniece of Alma through Jennifer's mother, Eleanor Lind Gonstrom. Eleanor had grown up in Lindsborg. I asked Jennifer if she might have any information about the Lind side of the family, and she said that she did. And now that I was working for the Minnesota Historical Society, and I was discussing this with a friend who is an editor and researcher at the Historical Society, my friend Debbie Miller said, perhaps you would like to document what you find. And so I called Jennifer, and she invited me to come to her home in Minneapolis and shared with me what she had. It was like doors and windows were open to the whole life of this remarkable woman. Alma Christina Lind was born December 11th, 1859, to Johann and Fredrika Lind. Her father brought her to be baptized the very next day, December 12th, 1859, the eve of Saint Lucia, at Brodarp Church, this church in Västergötland, Sweden. This is the medieval church where she was baptized. And here is the church as it stands today. This church was dedicated in 1899. It's built on the foundation of the medieval church. It's in a rural area, sort of in the middle of a forest, but surrounded by fields and small farms. And this is the baptismal font, saved from the medieval church where Alma was baptized, right at this font. The church records show that her godparents were Anders and Signe Gausdal, farmers from Gröndal. Now, I just want to put this in context. I want to share with you some other women who were born about the same year. Remember, Alma lived from 1859 to 1939. So this is Selma Lagerlof. She was born a year earlier, 1858, and lived to 1940. She was the beloved author of Nils and His Remarkable Journey and Gustav Berling's saga, among other novels, and she would win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1909. Karen Bergou Larsen, 1859 to 1920, created such a beautiful and loving family home that it is still renowned all over the world as the Swedish style. Her creation just happened to be painted by her husband, Carl Larsen. Anna Brundum Anker, born 1859 and lived to 1935, lived in the artist community of Skagen, Denmark. She would paint interior scenes of women and children, and also scenes like this one, of women going out to the field to help harvest wheat. And then there's Agnes Matilda Wergeland, who was born in 1857, died in 1914. She was the first woman ever to earn a doctoral degree in Norway, and eventually she immigrated to Wyoming. And women in America of that time, well, there was Annie Oakley from 1860 to 1926, Edith Carroll Roosevelt, the second wife of Teddy Roosevelt, born in 1861 to 1948, Jane Addams of Hull House, born in 1860 and 1935. In 1931, Jane Addams won the Nobel Prize for Peace. And there was Clara Driscoll, who was born in 1861. It was Clara Driscoll who Louis Comfort Tiffany appointed to head the women's department at Tiffany's. And the women at Tiffany's created these wonderful lamps. They are just getting their due recognition for that. In 1864, when Alma was 4 years old, she and her parents left everything they knew to emigrate to America. They were part of the Great Migration to a country that they believed offered their family more opportunity. Alma was an immigrant. The Lind family landed first in the rural community of Andover, Illinois, where the great Swedish singer Jenny Lind contributed funds to build a Lutheran chapel. The pastor of the church was one Jonas Swensson. He preached from this pulpit to overflow crowds. Pastor Swensson and his wife Maria, who both died at quite a young age, are buried here at Andover. And if you look at those dates, this means that Alma and Carl likely knew each other as children. In a few years, the Lind family moved to Moline, Illinois, here on the banks of the Mississippi River, and found a house on Henry Street, the same block as the Swedish Lutheran Church. And here on the corner of this block, you can see the house where they lived. Now, I'd like to point out that when this was drawn a few years before the new Swedish Lutheran Church was built, the church did not look like this, and you'll see that in a little while, in a few more slides. But the house that they lived in was there. So here's the Swedish Lutheran Church that Alma and her family belonged to. It was built in 1850. At the age of 12, Alma was named organist at this church. And at that time, the church had nearly 1,000 members. Now, it's a common fact that education for immigrant girls generally ended at confirmation, age 14. And Alma, as the oldest daughter, could have been expected to stay home and help care for her younger siblings and all the household chores that would be involved. But her parents saw a special gift in their daughter, and she went to high school, several blocks from home and up the hill from their home. The school is on Dean Street, as you can see. The building is no longer there, but here's a photo of the school that she attended. And look at those steps the students had to climb up to education and all it meant for a better life. Alma graduated from this high school in 1878, the only student with a Swedish surname. On Wednesday, September 15th, 1880, Alma Christina Lind married Carl Aaron Swensson at this new Swedish Lutheran sanctuary. The church was indeed so new that the 300 guests had to bring their own chairs for seating at the ceremony. Following the service, friends of the couple walked to Johann and Frederica's home for a reception honoring their daughter and her new husband. Carl was already an ordained pastor in the Augustana Lutheran Synod and called to Lindsborg and Bethany Lutheran Church. So when Alma stepped off the train in Lindsborg in September of 1880, the community was a typical Western town with one street defining east and west, tumbleweeds caught in the corners. The population of Lindsborg at that time was 469, and 194 of those people listed Sweden as their birthplace. With her musical gifts, Alma immediately became organist and choir director of Bethany Church, and here it is newly built in town. And here's the interior of the church at that time. Note that the organ is above the pulpit, and you can see the organ is right behind that star. I think it's decorated here, likely for Christmas. And like the pulpit at Andover, the pulpit and altar are in one piece. This is an American idea, one that did not last long in Lutheran tradition, but certainly saved space in those early pioneer churches. Alma and Carl lived in the parsonage next door to the church, and it is here that in December of 1881, the choir was invited to learn some new music. It was Handel's Messiah, and Alma taught them not only the music, but the words in English, and in a way, helped them find their American voice when everyone was still speaking Swedish when they weren't in school, if you will. They were still speaking Swedish in church, in their business enterprises, as customers and farmers across the fence, if you will. So she taught them to help them find their American voice. And this parsonage was the home of exceptional hospitality. The new, young, and eager professors from Sweden, hired by Bethany College, and lived at the parsonage until they found their footing. I'm showing this picture by Birger Sanzane because Sanzane wrote this about Alma Swensson. There is beautiful Christian fellowship in the Swensson home. Mrs. Swensson was a good wife, mother, and hostess. Her clear and practical understanding and her good judgment were often an invaluable help to her sanguine husband. Her abilities were often tested, we may be sure of that. The benevolent and hospitable Dr. Swensson often brought home unexpected guests to dinner or supper, such as students with their parents, farmers, fellow clergymen, and strangers whom he met in town or in his college office. I will testify that Mrs. Swensson was always able to make the best of the situation with cheerfulness and cordiality. A visit to the parsonage was an unforgettable pleasure, whether one was invited or not. And here, of course, is the Messiah Chorus and orchestra with soloists in the front in Ling Auditorium. If you look at this picture and you see in the very, very, very front, there's a woman in a white dress. And then to the left of her is Alma Swensson, sort of in the shadows. And there's Sanzane is sitting there. He was often the tenor soloist, and Alma was the soprano soloist. I don't have the names of the other soloists at the moment, but that gives an idea of what Alma and Carl created for Lindsborg. Even at that time, 469 people, and farmers around, and farm families, I should say, around the community. On June 6, 1892, Alma and her dear friend, Emmy Carlson Ewald, led prayer and thanksgiving at the parsonage. After the organization at Bethany Church, during the Synod Convention, all men of the Augustana Women's Missionary Society. Here's the marker that stands in Swensson Park. Alma was elected secretary and later became editor-in-chief of Missions Tidning, the monthly publication of the society that was sent to 25,000 households across the country. Alma and Carl raised two talented daughters in the public eye that is the parsonage. On the sitting next to Alma is Bertha Maria Frederica. Her wedding in 1907 to Axel Wessling was the social event of the decade. Bertha lived much of her adult life in Northfield, Minnesota, where Axel was dean at Carleton College. Her obituary in the Northfield News stated that she sang many solos throughout the community. And next to her is Ani Hilma Theodora, whose distinguished career at Bethany College as speech and drama professor and later Dean of Women spanned more than 40 years. In 1897, Alma and Carl traveled to Europe, accompanied by Birger Sandzane and others. They sailed on this ship, the SS Mongolia, where Carl gave speeches at evening programs about Bethany and Lindsborg, and you can be sure Swedish America, and Alma played the piano for singing. The trio attended London's triennial Handel Festival at the Crystal Palace, where they heard 3,500 performers sing Messiah. They attended the famous Stockholm Exhibition of Art and Industry of 1897, showcasing the works of such artists as Richard Berg, Anders Zorn, Carl Larsson, and Prince Eugene. And they traveled to Mora, where Sandzane introduced them to his mentor, Professor Anders Zorn. Now, it so happened that Zorn worked on his most famous painting, this one, Midsummer's Eve, that very year. And I'd like to think that perhaps Carl and Alma were among the first to see it on his easel. Maybe he said, well, what do you think of this? And they traveled to the island Marstrand on Sweden's west coast, where they had a private audience with King Oscar II. The audience was held here at the sort of summer community hall where all the social gatherings on Marstrand were held when the king was in residence. You see the monument of Oscar II in the front, is commemorating his many summers on Marstrand. And on the back is inscribed the date, 1897. When they returned home to Lindsborg, Carl and Alma were greeted by a huge crowd of people, happy to have them back. And planning began for the 20th anniversary of Bethany College and the constellation of church leaders and dignitaries who would attend the event, the 4-day event. The opening event, however, was a dinner at the parsonage held on November 9th, 1901. On the afternoon of November 9th, guests began arriving at the Union Pacific Depot, where they were met by a phalanx of carriages, who then formed a parade and were led by the Bethany College band to the parsonage, where they were greeted by Carl and Alma. Alma had engineered a magnificent sit-down dinner for 150 people. There were toasts and speeches, of course, throughout the evening, and the next day, a photo was taken. So here you see Alma is seated third from the left. She's wearing a white blouse. The gentleman next to her with the beard and hat is the highest guest of honor, Bishop Knut Henning Gazelius von Schiel of Sweden. And next to him is his wife, Lady Anna Gustava Maria von Schiel. Carl is in the center back. I think you can recognize him between the men with two hats. And to the far right is Jenny Lind, Alma's sister. She's rarely seen, and she's rarely recognized for her Herculean work as Carl's secretary. Next to Jenny is Bertha Swensson, and to the far left is Ani Theo. Well, just 3 years later, Carl died suddenly in Los Angeles while on a fundraising mission. The Augustana world mourned his passing on February 6, 1904. Here are the pallbearers bringing his body to the parsonage, where a review was held, and prayers, of course. His massive funeral was held at Ling Auditorium with many speeches, an orchestra, and the Bethany Oratorio Society singing excerpts from Messiah. He is buried at Elmwood Cemetery, and in the carriage are Bertha, Alma, and Annie Theo, about to leave the cemetery and now to begin their new lives. 1904 was also the year of the Augustana Synod meeting in Lindsborg, and it was held in this newly restored Bethany Church with the altar and pulpit hand-carved by the Palmquist brothers and altar paintings by Sanzane and Gian Malm. Alma continued as choir director and organist, and music filled her life and her spirit. She was able to live in this lovely home not far from the campus and Bethany Church. And again, her home became the center of hospitality. She was a community leader for women's suffrage and civil rights. Her niece, Eleanor Lindgonstrom, recalled that Alma took such principled standards for human rights that when she was asked to host Kansas Governor Henry Allen overnight, Alma was incensed that his chauffeur had to stay in Salina because of the color of his skin. The next slide, please. Alma continued her work with women's suffrage and with the Augustana Women's Missionary Society. And here is a photo of her and all the women who were the founders of the society. Alma entertained them at a reception at her home in the summer of 1919, the year before women's suffrage. Alma is seated in the center, right next to the woman wearing a dark dress. And that woman is the incredible and indomitable Emmy Ewald. In 1922, Alma was awarded an honorary doctorate in humane letters in recognition of her accomplishments and her service to the church and to Bethany College. She was now Dr. Alma Lind Swensson, but she would always call herself Mrs. Dr. Carl Swensson. And here's one of the last photos of Alma Lind Swensson, again at a Women's Missionary Society conference in Lindsborg, held in 1939. She's in the front row wearing a black dress, her ankles neatly crossed. In December of that year, Alma suffered a stroke just as her daughters were preparing for her 80th birthday celebration. Alma died on Saturday, December 16, 1939. Her daughters remembered that the Bethany church bell was ringing in the Sabbath as Alma took her last breath. Her funeral was held December 19th in Presser Hall. The Bethany Oratorio Society sang, "Surely he has borne our griefs." A soloist sang the solo that Alma often sang in Messiah, "I know that my Redeemer liveth." And at the very end, the entire Bethany chorus sang, "Worthy is the Lamb." Alma is buried next to Carl at Elmwood Cemetery. Her grave simply says, Alma Swensson, December 11th, 1859 to December 16th, 1939. And now, a statue of Alma Lind Swensson stands in Swensson Park, just where the parsonage stood. Alma holds a pitcher symbolizing her giving nature, pouring out generous hospitality, the gift of music, the gift of education, the gift of building community, of people understanding that together we can do more than we ever expected we could do alone. This statue and this park is a beautiful testament to the community that Alma created, to the woman she was, what she means for us, and what continues to this day for all of us who love music and education and who love Lindsborg, Kansas. Thank you very much. And I'd be happy to entertain some questions.